Hello and welcome to another installment of the Wyfutbol podcast with me, Ech Doku, and Michael Dryden. This week we take a look at why there have been so few teams from the old East Germany in the Bundesliga since its reunification in 1990. But before we start, please follow us on Twitter at Wyfutbol_ and subscribe with us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, and YouTube. Also, to highlight this week as well, Dryden is actually a history graduate. So this is one of his specialties in terms of the history of German football. So I'm really excited to get this one going. So, Dryden, how you doing?
I was going to perhaps drop that in right at the end if I got brave. I wasn't expecting that right away. But it's been a long time. I mean, I was graduated, it's like 6 years ago. So just FYI, for any questionable knowledge in this podcast, that is why. But no, I'm not bad, mate. Sunderland playing Arsenal tonight. Clash of the Y football Titans. Just really don't want to get smashed up by them. Was actually meant to go to the game, so I feel like I'm going to be annoyed either way. If we win, I'll be fuming. I didn't go to the game. If we lose badly, I'm going to be fuming for that reason. So I reckon decent performance by Sunderland and a tight 1-0 defeat would probably suit me. I think
Yeah,
naturally.
yeah. I mean, like, Arsenal going to make some changes. One of the things about disclaimer as well. If you've listened to the podcast for the first time, you'd be surprised to hear that Dryden supports Sunderland and I actually support
Mm.
Arsenal. Believe it or not. And I think one of Arteta's problems is that, well, for Sunderland, is he doesn't really rotate. I don't know why. Like Wenger, like if this is Arsene Wenger, what we probably would have done is you'd get some youth players that probably have not played all season playing. The likes of Florian Balogun's only played a game. Some of the real youth players in the squad, Salah being another one. Not the Salah at Liverpool. There is a Salah in Arsenal's youth setup. But with Arteta, I think your only worries you're going to get fringe players that really want to play. I expect Pepe to play tonight. El
Mm.
Neni. These are guys who aren't really cutting it in the Prem, but are very experienced. But you never know; they're going to be rusty. It is a quarter final. They're probably not as bothered. Some of the players I've mentioned have got African Cup of Nations,
Mm.
and I think if Sunderland are up for it, then there's definitely a scalp to be had. So yeah, we'll have to wait and see.
Well, it's one of those where like Arsenal have been in really good form recently, which is good in a way that that might allow Arteta some room to rotate, where he hasn't got the pressure of going out. If Arsenal had still maintained that form from the first 3 games of the season, and Arteta was somehow still there, and they would languish in 10th, I really do not think we would be seeing a rotated team come out tonight. I think we'd be seeing the guns come out. However, now with a bit of form, but then again, if the team's in form, you don't want to play them, so it's really hard. It's really hard to
Yeah,
judge.
yeah, I think it's one of those as well. That our squad's just too big without European football, so we are definitely going to rotate. It's just that some of those guys coming in are really gonna want to stake their claim. Some of them for transfers. You're looking at
Mm.
Maitland-Niles. You're looking at Eddie Nketiah. You're looking at El Neni as well. Lacazette might play. These are all guys who have got deals running down. So, yeah, it'll be an interesting game. I expect Arsenal to win. I have a feeling it will be more of a 1 or 2 nil. We're not big scorers, to be honest. Haven't really been under Arteta, so yeah, be interesting to see how the game is today.
Yeah, and aside from that, got the booster and feel awful. So just FYI on that. But Etch, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, mate. So since you've had the booster, how's that affected your eyesight? Your eyesight's still good?
What do you mean?
Huh? No,
What do you mean?
because prior to the booster jab, you had terrible dress sense. I'm hoping after it's improved somewhat.
I saw. You know what's getting annoying, right? This is a complete sidetrack, but
Yeah,
you know how Specsavers love piping up on Twitter whenever like something happens. It's
yeah,
like a marketing thing. I think like
yeah,
Kane had said how he got the ball against Liverpool, where he
yeah.
just absolutely clattered Robertson or whatever. And then Specsavers like tweet saying, "Oh, do you need some help from us, mate?" It's getting old.
The thing is, we didn't even touch about that game. The problem with that match was when you're Harry Kane, right? You know, I guess they're going to ask you about the red cards. The fact he's just said it with chest, like, yeah, it wasn't a red. It's like, come on, bro. Like,
Mm,
yeah, I mean, that one, we didn't even talk about that game. Yeah, that game was quite mad because I'm all for VAR. And, as an Arsenal fan, we've been wronged by it loads, but some of those decisions were mad. Like, not even the fact
mm,
that it's gone to VAR. I believe the Kane one, they just said, yeah, it doesn't need to be reviewed, which is mad in itself. Um, yeah, they were just shocking decisions. I don't think we should obviously scrap it because that makes no sense. But how I just don't understand why Kane wasn't sent off.
Mm.
And Liverpool have a right to be aggrieved. Robertson deserved to be sent off as well. But yeah, should Kane have gone specs? Players and managers never lie. Often they say they didn't see it, but obviously Kane was in the tackle, so he can't say, you know what, mate, I missed that one. Um, so yeah, it was unfortunate. Luckily, Robertson wasn't seriously hurt. I think
Mm.
that's the main thing as well. But
Indeed.
yeah, definitely a red card, definitely. But anyway, moving on to the topic today, which is just your specialist area, as I've mentioned a few times. Why did you decide to look into this episode?
So I mean, there wasn't actually too much relevance to the current, well, of the current day in terms of like right now at Christmas time. However, the top four of the Bundesliga currently, and actually that's not a surprise because most of the Bundesliga are made up of teams from the old West Germany, and it's a kind of topic we've had on our ideas list since the podcast began. To be honest, why are there so few clubs from the old East Germany in the Bundesliga? I mean, it should not be news to anyone that Germany was divided between East Germany and West Germany for most of almost the entirety of the second half of the 20th century following World War II. The country was partitioned into zones after the war between 1945 and 49. Um, and the East and West remained divided until reunification in 1990. In 1949, the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, was established by the USSR in the East, and the Federal Republic of Germany, the FRG, was established by the Allies in the West. So from 1949 to 1990, these two states operated side by side, but not in unison. One point to note, which is really interesting, I didn't really know this until looking into this episode, is West Germany was actually quite a bit larger than East Germany. And upon reunification, the West had roughly four times the inhabitants compared with the West, which somewhat makes sense because they were sponsored by the USSR, whereas the West inside of Germany was sponsored by US, but you also had influence from the British and the French who kind of laid claim to territory after the war. So it does make sense, but I think that's a real good point to note for this topic. You've got a West German side, which is much larger in terms of population, and also larger in terms of size. Um, so currently, only three of the current 18 Bundesliga teams occupy the eastern part of Germany. That's Hertha Berlin, Union Berlin, and RB Leipzig. Hertha were actually part of West Germany because they occupied the western side of Berlin. Wolfsburg is the one I've missed out there. They are arguably east geographically. They're very, very central, not too far from Berlin. Um, but they were actually part of the old West Germany. I say not too far from Berlin. They're about 200 kilometers away. But yeah, it's a bit of a grey area there. But that leaves us with two clubs really in the Bundesliga: Union Berlin and RB Leipzig. The latter did not exist before German reunification, so you've really only got Union Berlin from the old GDR that currently occupy the Bundesliga. So this episode is looking into why that is the case. The current Western dominance. We'll take a look at the old East German League, the old kind of divided national teams. We'll touch on as well communism in football, which is kind of the backdrop to why there was such a divide, and we'll look at whether the footballing unification or reunification failed in Germany in 1990 onwards.
Yeah, I think it's one of those of RB Leipzig that you have to always mention their name with gritted teeth. Obviously our inaugural pod, the very first one for the history books. We spoke a lot about that, and how it kind of that's how I realized, and this is why it was one of our first ideas why in East Germany there's so few German clubs, because I looked at a map when I was doing that pod, and I was like,
Mm,
there's just no clubs there, and I wondered why. Obviously, you would have thought in 2021, soon to be 22, that RB Leipzig would be a pioneer for East German football, but
mm,
through the way it's circumvented the 50+1 rule and the way it's got its money and its influence in Red Bull, it's kind of like a outlier in that region, and it hasn't
mm.
really led to a surge in Eastern German football teams, which we'll touch on later on.
Yeah, because they're so unique and obviously backed by such wealth. So it's hard to for any other club to really compare in that area or to mimic them in a sense. So moving on to kind of the context around the current situation. So kind of the Western domination since reunification in the 1990s. There's some mad facts here. So in the 20 years between the 93 and 94 season and the 2013-14 season, only 4 teams from the former GDR reached the Bundesliga out of the 38 clubs in total that managed to reach the German top tier in that time. Since then, only Leipzig have added to that list, and there was no East German teams in the Bundesliga between 2009 and 2016 prior to Leipzig's promotion. When I say East German, I mean the old East Germany, GDR. Just to reiterate that before I get any hate mail. Germany's 2010 and 2014 World Cup squads had only one player born in the former GDR. That was Tony Cruz. Klose and Podolski were actually the only other two not born in the old West Germany. So only 3 of the entire squad weren't born in West Germany. Klose and Podolski being born in Poland. Um, in the entire period between reunification and 2020, there have never been more than 2 sides from the old GDR present in the Bundesliga at one time. Currently, it's just Union Berlin and RB Leipzig that occupy the Bundesliga as clubs based in the old East Germany. Um, and it's no surprise to anyone that no team from the old GDR has won the Bundesliga since reunification, largely because Bayern have won most of them. But the other sides that have done are also from the old West Germany. No former East German team has won the DFB Pokal, the equivalent of the FA Cup in Germany. Um, but as you kind of alluded to, and as I did as well, RB Leipzig have been the kind of the biggest side in that area, the best side in recent years from the old GDR territory, entering European competition consistently in the Champions League. Um, but as I said, they've only formed what was it 2009, so they weren't around to feel the real effects of the reunification process, a process that we'll come on to. So to move on to the East German League. So this is the old German league in the old GDR. So the East German League was initially known as the DS Oberliga from 1949, and then altered to DDR Oberliga in 1958, and was part of the league structure within what was known as the DFV, effectively the FA of the GDR. Um, the last DDR Oberliga season, due to reunification, was the 1990-91 season. Um, from 1954-55 season up until reunification, the league was made up of 14 teams with 2 relegations, so not a large structure. The most successful clubs were Berliner FC Dynamo with 10 titles, SG Dynamo Dresden with 8 titles, and FC Vorwärts Frankfurt with 6 titles. Berliner FC Dynamo were the famous Stasi team that began to be hated by a lot of people in the East. The last ever DDR Oberliga champions were Hansa Rostock, who are currently I think, in the second division of the Bundesliga. Um, and particularly in the 1970s, 1980s, clubs from the former German Democratic Republic actually made regular appearances in the latter stages of European competitions, which was news to me looking at this topic. Magdeburg won the European Cup Winners' Cup in 1974, beating AC Milan. Karl Zeiss Jena and Lokomotiv Leipzig both made the final of that competition. And Dynamo Dresden played an East German record 98 games in Europe. So that's just a bit of context to say, look, the East German league was a lot smaller and has been a lot smaller than the Western equivalent during that time. But there was some forays in Europe and some success on the continental stage, not just isolated in the east of Germany.
Yeah, the Cup Winners' Cup's decent. I mean, Arsenal won it under
Here we go.
yeah, Arsenal won there under Big George Graham. In case anyone didn't know that, just give it a little Google. I think I beat Palmer actually
Mm.
before I graced the earth. So it was before, I think it was in either '93 maybe, or maybe it was '94. But that is interesting because I think Eastern German football. We're going to touch on the national sides in a bit, but you just don't hear about it. Like obviously we weren't alive in the '70s or '60s. Well, rumor has it I was, but in fact I wasn't. And it's just one of those things where I know so little about it, and there's just not that much information on it, or the information that's there is quite weak in terms of I didn't know the most successful clubs there.
Mm,
We spoke about the Bundesliga earlier, and we were like, most of the clubs you mentioned, apart from Leipzig, of course, I don't associate with huge amounts of success. So to see them actually win a Milan side who are so historically so famous
mm.
is really impressive. And it's a shame that Eastern German football didn't really kick on from that. I have my ideas as to why that was the case, but it's still a shame nonetheless.
Yeah, true. Do you not think the European Cup Winners' Cup is just a nice idea, a nice thing that once happened? Because realistically, I mean, so say Sunderland tonight, we're playing Arsenal. I know it's the League Cup. If we go through and we eventually win that competition as probably the first League One club and probably it's a long time to do so, we'll qualify for the Europa League. That is so irrelevant. I mean, it's a kind of a real extreme example, but like even if you're like a Wigan Athletic who won the FA Cup back in the day, or even if like a better example, you are a mid-table Premier League club now, or bottom half, would you not rather go into like a competition like that against other cup winners rather than go into the Europa League, where eventually you play against Champions League sides? Kind of waste your time a bit, even though there are some financial
Yeah, I think
benefits.
well, it's like how the Champions League is just to be the champions. All of it is done to increase money, broadcasting, and games. Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's quite nice to have a competition which is just the cup winners. But the problem is that with the way money works is that will always exclude. There are so few trophies. If Sunderland go and win the FA Cup, UEFA don't want them to be in the Cup Winners' Cup alone because they're going to lose out money from Arsenal not being there. Or a better
Mm.
example would be Chelsea or Spurs or Leicester because they've been performing better than Arsenal have lately. They don't want that. They just don't want that. That's why they keep expanding it and they make new competitions and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger because they want the big teams essentially to face each other as often as possible. And that's why we had that little thing called the Europa Super League. No, what was it called? The Super League, not Europa Super League, European Super League. Because that's what they want really. So yeah, it would be
Mm.
quite nice. I think the idea of all of us here have won the cups, but yeah, when you've got Juventus knocking on the door crying that they're not involved, and Man United crying because they're not involved, and everyone else, then that's why UEFA tries to tweak it to fit everyone in.
Mm. I mean, it's a bit of a tangent, but it does actually relate a bit to East Germany because the fact they were able to have a bit of a foray just was kind of owed itself to the fact that back in that time it wasn't so kind of commercialized, whereas now we've seen it's just the same teams over and over in European competition. So even with the introduction of the European Conference League, so moving on to kind of this kind of section would be more to kind of compare with the West. So it's kind of a look at the national teams and also to touch on kind of the fortunes of some of the Western German clubs as well. So East Germany and West Germany only faced each other actually on one occasion. And East Germany actually won that game 1-0 in 1974 group stage match in Hamburg in the 1974 World Cup. East Germany were actually eliminated in the second group stage, whereas West Germany actually went on to win the competition. I read a little bit about how that was a big win for East Germany, but when your rivals then go on to win it, it kind of takes away a little bit of that. And so, yeah, during division, West Germany won 3 World Cups as a national side and 2 Euros, appearing in 3 other World Cup finals and 1 other Euro final, which is just mental. In terms of the clubs, there was success over that period, which was quite astonishing. In the 1970s, 1980s, first a lot of people will know, owed in part to the rise of a young Bayern Munich side and also a Borussia Mönchengladbach side that is less well known. Um, there's a lot of successful West German football in Europe at the time. The legendary Gerd Muller and Franz Beckenbauer coming through at Bayern during the 70s and 80s, and really, really West German football went from strength to strength, not just in terms of club football, but international. And it is linked because, it's no surprise, it's no kind of coincidence that those Bayern sides and the Borussia Mönchengladbach side went on to achieve such great success domestically and international, continentally in Europe, but then also the international team benefits at that time. I think the success or but the strength of your domestic side probably have more bearing on the success of your national team because the likelihood is less players will play overseas. So I do think it's linked to the fact that the East German league, East German football was somewhat a bit more primitive. The league structure was smaller. And we'll go on to talk about this, but investment comes from that as well, not just because they're communist, but just because of obviously the fact that they're smaller and have less population. So I think it's a really interesting point. East Germany, as a national team, only actually qualified for that one World Cup, 1974, where they beat Germany, and they never qualified for a Euros. So, kind of a sign of the kind of disparity in terms of club and international football between the West and the East.
Yeah, I mean the record's hardly ever discussed. Eastern Germany, I can see why. It's actually a sporcle of first countries that enter the World Cup for the first time. I remember getting East Germany's wrong because I thought that they'd. I think it's countries that have only been in the World Cup once.
Mm,
What was the year they entered it? And obviously East Germany, a country I didn't know a great deal about at the time. And yeah, I can illustrated from the above. It's quite clear. West Germany are synonymous with success. I wouldn't say iconic football, just a
mm.
very regimented machine that got results. But yeah, their East German counterparts are hardly ever discussed.
Yeah, you think of that period, what, 9 finals,
Yeah.
5 wins, 4 it's just 4, runners-up medals, it's absolutely crazy. Just a just unrivaled success in that time. So yeah, moving on to kind of a look into why maybe East German football remains so primitive compared to the West and perhaps other nations in in the West generally or in Western football. There's a really good article by Jack Fildew in these Football Times called "The East German Curse: How Football in Reunification Failed," which is where I've taken a little bit of this information from, just to reference. But it's a really fascinating article because it really talks about how kind of the society in East Germany during division had its effect on football and sport generally. And it goes on to mention about politically, sport was seen as a powerful tool for East Germany. As you mentioned at the start, I studied history. I did quite a lot of Soviet history actually, not so much on East Germany, but on the growth of the USSR. And for sport is really seen as that as a tool for some of the values that are really endearing and very close to communist ideology. Um, but for the regime in East Germany, Olympic sports were prioritized over football because that's had more kind of sway on the international stage. Um, the regime wanted to prove themselves in the West and also internationally, and the Olympic Games is often seen as that real stage in which you can do so, as opposed to a single sport like football, even though it was growing rapidly.
Yeah, it's just interesting how much decision making from a group, i.e., the communist regime, can therefore dictate how sport actually grew during that time and unfortunately got left behind. I mean, yeah, Olympic sports does kind of make sense because there's so many more medals to be won, and
Mm.
football wasn't what we know of it now. It wasn't probably the biggest sport in the world then. It wasn't as commercialized. The revenues weren't as big. It wasn't even as popular. But it's just interesting how literally by a group of people deciding what you can and can't do has basically meant that East Germany's been left behind and is feeling the effects even to today.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you've obviously got like a communist state there where, the idea of, particularly at that time, it's probably changed a lot now, but the idea of a private enterprise is a lot, is not really as much of a thing at all. So a lot of institutions are run by the state, and so they have a lot of control over what happens with them.
Mm,
And there's a lot of good about that in a way. Some you could
yeah.
argue the idea that they keep the clubs grounded for the people against all this commercialization we see in the West. But in terms of growth, it does nothing to assist with that. Um, so yeah, the GDR diverted youngsters' affection for football towards other sports, in which multiple medals could be won at the Olympics at the Olympic level. We even kind of see that in a way now. We see US and China hit the top of that. They've got big populations, they're massive economies, but you always seem to think you see the medal table and think there's definitely some political game going on here. Even just with the United Kingdom or Team GB pouring money into cycling over the last like sort of 10, 15 years, like there's always seems to be an ulterior motive behind it, and I think the Olympics is that stage for those type of ulterior motives. Um, and as a result, they grew great affection for the West Germany team within East Germany because they probably felt they didn't really have, um, you know, like basically a team worthy of supporting, particularly if there's not any interest in the sport from the regime. And as was the hatred for the Stasi and the Stasi influenced football clubs, there was even internal hatred for domestic clubs such as Berliner FC Dynamo, which I kind of touched on before. But as popularity of football across Eastern Europe grew, or Europe generally. The GDR slowly began to allow it, and the sport grew in East Germany in the 70s and 80s, as their kind of light success in Europe would demonstrate. But while football was thus permitted and growing in East Germany, the principles of communist society still served to inhibit and control it, as we touched on before. Former Dynamo Dresden striker Matthias Sammer, who was actually, I believe, he used to be or is still, I think he's director of football at Bayern Munich, actually, but I need to check that. So Matthias Sammer, star of the Dynamo Dresden side, or a Dynamo Dresden side at that time, said that one day the entire squad was awarded with new boots. Mine were the only ones that did not fit, being 3 sizes too large. It's not a secret that it was a form of harassment, as individualism was tolerated. So it was this idea that, flair, individual talent, was kind of frowned upon over the collective, which is very much like almost a socialist and very much a communist kind of ideology in society, is that the collective works together to benefit everyone, as opposed to individuals doing so or leading that state. Even though, ironically, over time there was great it was great autocrats that led the USSR. Um, so yeah, the idea was that football was permitted for educational purposes rather than enjoyment. East German Minister for Sport Manfred Ewald said that sport is not private amusement; it is social and patriotic education. Um, so yeah, it gives you a great flavour of how they used football. And finally, on this, the Stasi interfered in the lives of players and tracked defectors to the west. There's a few examples that I won't go on due to time, of players defecting from the east to the west, and being tracked down by the Stasi. Not always were they penalised in some way, but there's one in particular example where a player actually eventually was killed in an accident that was argued to have been orchestrated by the Stasi, but was never proven. And so when you've got players playing football and growing up and learning their trade in a society like that, it does kind of add to this idea that, was it really a hotbed for growing football clubs and football talent? Probably not. So the final kind of point or section of this episode really is looking at, therefore, was reunification a failure? And it kind of goes somewhere to answering the question of why is there so few German or old East German clubs in the Bundesliga? Um, So upon reunification, which happened around the 1990 unification of the nation as a whole, the top two teams from the old DDR Oberliga, the old East German League, Hansa Rostock and Dynamo Dresden, were added to the Bundesliga. Third to sixth joined the second division, while seventh to 12th entered a playoff to qualify for the second division. So effectively, two teams joined the Bundesliga and five joined the second, which, is not a great deal. The integrated sides had come from, a failing GDR economy, and themselves unable to compete financially with Western clubs, particularly now without their Stasi backers. You think about a lot of these clubs, such as Dynamo Berliner, they were largely influenced by the Stasi. The Stasi were no longer there, or not formally, and so they didn't have that control. But they also hadn't had the kind of economic benefits of perhaps being in a Western economy as opposed to the East, where they weren't seen as businesses, they weren't seen as private enterprises. And so, even though at that time, well, we're talking about the 90s now, but even over the 70s and 80s, the commercialization of football hadn't really kicked off. You still think that would be a great gulf between the clubs in the East and the West. And obviously, when you then integrate into a single league and other clubs have far better resources, they can pay higher wages, they can sign players for fees that you can't do. Ultimately, you're going to be on the back foot. And also, just look at the number of teams that went into that. And we're talking about reunification. What we're actually talking about is the integration of East German clubs into the Western leagues. So it's not like they're just merging two leagues together. They're taking the better teams from the old league, and they're like forcing them into the Bundesliga. I think quite a really loose example of how that would apply in maybe another nation would be like if for some reason the SPL and the Premier League decided to mix. I know now that would be a really, really in terms of like the amount of money that's in each league and each game, that would be the disparity would be huge, and you probably wouldn't see too many SPL teams in the Premier League. But I remember we used to have this argument. I think it was like probably over 10 years ago. They used to talk about, would Celtic perform well in the Premier League? Would Rangers? And it'd be supposed to be a similar sort of thing. You're kind of trying to integrate clubs into existing league structure, where you've already got existing teams as well, who, they're not going to be happy if loads of East German teams come into the Bundesliga and force them out the league. So they had to make space for them, and only so many could come into it. So I think they were already on the back foot for so many reasons. But yeah, so I mean, clubs like Bayern had great success in the 70s and 80s, with their growth unrestricted and a very highly capitalist economy. I mean, look at them today; they've flourished. Um, they've flourished in that time. Um, thus, it's no real surprise then that these German clubs, that integrated failed to keep up, and we could go on, but I think that is the key message. Individualism was frowned upon. The collective was seen as the means to success, but actually, as at individual club level, these clubs were becoming unequal to their Western counterparts, and when they integrated, they just couldn't match them.
I think that time frame in football is so key for clubs to grow. Obviously, teams like Chelsea, City, and now Newcastle, just don't get upset, can attest to that. But in terms of growth, you're right. Bayern Munich was quietly building a behemoth, which is now
Mm,
pretty much unstoppable. And no, the German club is really near them, but that stifling of East German clubs during that period, plus the fact that Germany has a 50+1 rule, I'm not too sure precisely when that came in, but that obviously prevents you from kind of growing, with an external source, i.e., investors, and it can just you can see why East German clubs didn't really prosper as they may well have done with the right levels of backing and investment, especially with their governments leaning towards an Olympic approach in terms of where they're going to get the medals and success from.
mm,
That coupled with the biggest team that we do have in the East being RB Leipzig go against that in every way, shape, and form. One, they have heavy investment and have managed to
mm,
circumvent the 50+1 rule by having dodgy, like so-called fans as part of the 50. Which all points to kind of a sad tale, really, in terms of not having an even distribution of successful clubs across Germany. I think a wider point about a lot of this is Germany's model from then even to now is basically all catered towards one, it being a country that loves football, but yet is very heavily dominated on one side of the country, which lacks distribution, and two, that all of those clubs feed into Bayern, which we've discussed on a few occasions.
mm.
If we were to say now, or now that they're united as one country, well, why can't clubs in Eastern Germany rise up the leagues? But the regulations and the power of Bayern Munich have just prevented that, really. And now their best hope is RB Leipzig, but then they have their own problems as well. So it's kind of just this machine where no matter what levers you pull and what buttons you press, it ends up with no teams in East Germany, and any good players they do have at RB Leipzig, and ultimately any good, really, really good players end up at Bayern.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point, because some of the other sides in the old West Germany have come and gone. Dortmund are back and are a big side again. I remember them being quite a decent force in the early 2000s, but they really fell off for a long time in terms of like being a player on the European stage. Obviously, they reached the final. I think it was 2013, and we all felt that heartbreak when they lost to Bayern. But the real mainstay, and they are, based in the old West Germany, are Bayern. As you rightly said, every other club is almost like a satellite around them that kind of like feeds off that large behemoth of a club. And so, what chance do these East German sides have of ever emulating that when the status quo just remains a status quo? But yeah, I think it's a really powerful point.
Right, I guess we'll end it there for this week. Thank you very much, Ryan, for the information. A real history flashback, this one, that
Mm,
came back into
yeah.
the split between East Germany and West Germany and their footballing traditions and how they kind of came to be. So thank you for that. And thanks to you all for listening. Some big plans coming up in January,
Mm.
for the very few of you that probably listen to this part of the podcast. So thanks for thanks for listening all the way to the end, and you'll hear from us soon. Thanks a lot, guys.
Cheers, guys.